Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going way back in time to the early 2000s to see how experts were thinking about terrorism research. You shared some really interesting source material with me. It's like a whole collection of research abstracts and annotations all on terrorism from like a big bibliography project.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what the field looked like back then.
Instead of, focusing on specific terrorist attacks, we're going to kind of pull back the curtain and see how these researchers were building their knowledge base, what kind of questions they were asking, what methods were they using.
Yeah, it's like a behind-the-scenes look at the world of terrorism research.
Exactly. And I think we might find some surprising connections, to things like psychology, history, religion, even stuff like group dynamics, which you don't always think about when you think about terrorism. Are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. So first things first. Context, right? This wasn't just some random collection of articles they threw together. These researchers were seriously meticulous putting together this whole bibliography.
Yeah, they were incredibly systematic about it, using very specific keywords in their searches, cross-referencing with all these other major reviews. They even consulted with experts in the field to make sure they weren't missing any crucial pieces.
Wow. That's some serious dedication to being thorough. It makes me wonder, what was their selection process like? Like, there's this note here. It says, for a search on political violence, come you in psychology, they got 149 results, but only kept 10 of them.
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. It really speaks to the rigor of academic research. They weren't just throwing in anything that just mentioned terrorism. They had very clear criteria,
Right.
to make sure everything was high quality and actually relevant.
Gotcha. And speaking of quality, the team behind this whole project was pretty impressive, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking huge names in terrorism research, like Dr. Martha Crenshaw. Have you come across her work in your own research?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's like required reading if you're studying this stuff. What I find really interesting is it wasn't just academics on the team. They had government agencies involved, like the UK Home Office and the US Naval Criminal Investigative Service, even private organizations like the research firm, Centra.
It just shows you how important collaboration is.
Yeah.
When you're tackling these big, complex issues, they realized that they needed to bring in expertise from all these different areas. Not just the academic perspective, but also insights from those on the front lines, like counter-terrorism folks.
Oh, yeah. I bet that led to some interesting discussions.
I'm sure it did. And you can really see that spirit of collaboration in the variety of research they collected. I mean, we'll get into some specific examples in a minute, but just to give you an idea, we'll be looking at studies on religious justifications for violence, behavioral profiles of terrorists, even the role of group dynamics in radicalization.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued. Give me one of these fascinating annotations.
Okay, let's start with one that really caught my eye. Religion and Terrorism, an Interfaith Perspective by A.M. Al-Khattar, published in 2003.
Religion and terrorism, always a complicated one. What's unique about this study?
Instead of just focusing on one religion, right, Al-Khattar interviewed religious leaders from Jewish, Christian, 80 Islamic traditions to see how each of them might justify violence.
Wow. So he went straight to the source, people who are deeply knowledgeable about their faiths. Did he find any common ground between them?
What's interesting is he identified 4 justifications. That came up across all 3 religions. The first one was the idea of a just war, like a war that's morally permissible under certain criteria.
Right. That concept goes way back.
It does. And it raises these really interesting questions about how these ancient ideas about warfare could actually influence how we think about terrorism today. The second justification was the idea of preventing future violence, like a preemptive strike.
That's always ethically tricky.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's self-defense, which was pretty straightforward. All 3 faiths endorsed it, but only as a last resort to protect lives. And finally, the idea of controlling land mostly came from the Muslim and Jewish leaders.
I see. What I find interesting is all of these justifications, except maybe that last one about land, they could apply to situations beyond terrorism, right? Like war, self-defense, preemptive strikes. It makes you think about, like, the whole human capacity for violence.
That's a great point. Al-Khattar's work really pushes us to think about the roots of violence in a broader context, not just within the specific realm of terrorism and that kind of expansive thinking. Ties up in other research, too.
Wow, you're really making me think. Okay, let's move on to another study. You mentioned something about, like, behavioral perspectives.
Yes. There's this book from 1981, remember, going way back, called Behavioral and Quantitative Perspectives on Terrorism by Alexander and Gleason.
1981, that's got to be like the dawn of this whole field of research, right?
Pretty much.
Okay.
He gives us a snapshot of how researchers were trying to build a more, I guess, scientific understanding of terrorism, moving beyond just describing what was happening.
So were they like crunching numbers even back then?
They were trying to. One of the things in this book is a proposed organizational profile of terrorist groups by a researcher named Tom Strentz. He divides these groups into three main roles: leaders, activist operators, and idealists.
That's so interesting, that classic triangle structure. Leaders, doers, thinkers, you see that everywhere in businesses, social movements.
Right. It's surprisingly simple,
Right.
but really effective for understanding how these groups work. Leaders set the vision. Activists carry out the operations. And idealists, provide the ideology, the fuel that keeps it going.
Even back then, they were recognizing the importance of group dynamics. It's not just about individual psychology, but how individuals interact within the group.
Exactly. And while their statistical analysis was, kind of limited by the data that was available back then, it's fascinating to see them trying to bring that quantitative rigor to the field.
So they were laying the groundwork for more data-driven approaches. Amazing to see how research evolves, right? What else do we have in store?
How about we jump ahead a few years to 1996? There's a pretty chilling account in this book called Holy Terror, Armageddon in Tokyo by D.W. Brackett.
Holy Terror, Armageddon. Okay, those titles are not exactly comforting. What's this one about?
It's about this Buddhist sect that turned into like an apocalyptic terrorist group called Shinrikyo. They're the ones who carried out the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway.
Oh, yeah. That was a horrifying attack. I remember learning about it.
What's especially disturbing about this case is that they were able to acquire all this dangerous material and technology within a stable, developed country like Japan.
So it shattered that assumption that it only happens in unstable countries.
Right. And it raised all these questions about how you can possibly prevent groups from getting the means to carry out these attacks, even in seemingly secure places.
I can see how that case would have been a wake-up call for everyone. Researchers, policymakers. It's one thing to study terrorism in theory, but then to see those consequences in the real world.
Definitely. And I think it's the diversity of this research that makes it so captivating. We've gone from these religious justifications to like behavioral analysis to a real-world case study of this horrifying attack. It just shows how multifaceted this field really is.
For sure. And speaking of diversity, I'm curious to see what other kind of research was being done. We've talked about religion, psychology. What else were these experts looking into?
Well, let's shift gears a bit and look at this study on right-wing extremism, Terror from the Extreme Right, published in 1995 by Tore Bjorgo. He focuses on Scandinavia.
Scandinavia? Not the first place that comes to mind when you think about right-wing terrorism.
And that's what makes Bjorgo's work so important. He challenges those assumptions about where and how these ideologies take root.
I like it. So what did he find? Were there any common themes in this Scandinavian right-wing violence?
One of the key things he points out is the motivations were actually really diverse. It goes beyond just saying, oh, it's all about racism. He highlights the work of Helmut Willems, who identified 4 types of people involved in this racial violence: ideological activists, xenophobes, criminals, and something called fellow travelers.
Fellow travelers. Now, that's an interesting term. What exactly does that mean?
These are folks who maybe aren't totally committed to the ideology, but they get drawn in by the group itself, the sense of belonging, camaraderie, maybe even the thrill of being part of something transgressive.
It's a good reminder that human motivations are never simple. Sometimes it's less about these deeply held beliefs and more about those social and psychological needs.
Exactly. And Bjorko really stresses how powerful those group dynamics can be, especially for drawing young people into these extremist groups.
That makes me think about how when you're trying to counter terrorism, you can't just focus on the ideology, right? You have to consider those social and psychological factors that make those groups appealing.
Absolutely. It brings us to another book that really gets into the personal experiences of those involved in terrorism. Inside the UDA, Volunteers and Violence, published in 2003 by Colin Crawford.
The UDA, remind me.
The Ulster Defence Association. It was this loyalist paramilitary group in Northern Ireland. A lot of the books on the Troubles, that's what the conflict there is called, focus on the IRA. the Republican side.
So this is a look at the other side, the loyalists who wanted to stay with the UK. What kind of perspective does he bring?
One of his main arguments is that terrorists are often just ordinary people who are, driven past their breaking point. And he supports this by sharing all these really detailed firsthand accounts from UDA members, a lot of whom were actually incarcerated when he interviewed them.
Wow, so he's getting these really personal stories about how they got involved in this violence.
Yeah, it's this powerful reminder that people we label as terrorists, they aren't necessarily monsters or fanatics, they're human beings with complex backgrounds and motivations.
And understanding that complexity is so important for developing effective strategies, right? It can't just be about demonizing the other side.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even as we condemn the violence itself.
We've covered so much ground already: religion, psychology, group dynamics, even personal accounts from those involved in the conflict. What else do we have time for before we wrap up this part?
Let's touch on one more study. It's a paper from 1998 called Bombing and Psychopathy, an integrative review by J.R. Malloy and J.E. McEllistrom.
Bombing and psychopathy. Okay, that sounds intense. What's the main focus here?
Instead of looking at terrorist groups as a whole, they zoom in on a specific tactic, bombing. They wanted to understand, what makes someone choose that particular method of violence.
Interesting. So they were trying to create a profile of a bomber.
One of their main takeaways is there isn't one single profile. Bombers come from all sorts of backgrounds, have a huge range of motivations.
So you can't just say, all bombers are psychopaths.
Right. But they did find some intriguing connections between the behaviors and motivations of bombers and some of the traits associated with psychopathy, although they stressed the need for more research in that area.
It's all about the nuances, right? I'm curious, what did they say about the appeal of bombing? Why do so many groups choose that tactic?
They highlighted 5 key reasons. The first one is just effectiveness. Bombings are often lethal, they're indiscriminate, and they create widespread fear.
Can't really argue with that. What else?
Second, the technology and knowledge needed to build bombs is becoming more and more accessible. Third, it can be executed by just one person, if they have the right expertise, of course. And fourth, they pointed to improved timing devices, which means less risk for the bomber.
So from a purely tactical standpoint, it's a pretty terrifyingly effective option.
And lastly, they talk about the media attention that bombings generate.
Yeah.
The bigger the explosion, the more casualties, the more it gets covered, and the more fear it spreads.
It's a horrific equation, but it often works, unfortunately. Terrorists know that the media amplifies their message.
Exactly. So Malloy and McEllistrom's work offers this really valuable look at the strategic side of bombing. It's not just mindless destruction. There's a calculated logic behind it.
And understanding that logic is so important for figuring out how to counter it. This has been such an amazing overview of just a handful of the studies in this collection. We've gone from this really meticulous work of building a knowledge base to grappling with these really hard questions about violence, motivation, the human element of terrorism.
Oh, yeah. We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in this research.
I know I'm ready for more. But for now, let's take a little pause. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into some of those recurring themes and debates that pop up in this collection. What kind of patterns or connections did you see?
Oh, there's some really interesting ones, especially around the role of psychology, the complexities of motivation, and the impact of social and political context.
Can't wait to hear more about that. We'll be back soon.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were looking at some individual studies from that amazing collection of terrorism research. It's fascinating to see how many different angles these experts were using, even way back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it really is. And as we go deeper into this material, some key themes start to emerge, some big questions that these researchers were grappling with.
I'm all ears. What were some of the recurring themes, the things that kept popping up in the research?
One of the biggest ones, and probably the most debated, was the role of psychology. In trying to understand terrorism. Is there such a thing as a terrorist personality? Can you actually predict who's going to become a terrorist based on their personality?
That's a question that I bet people have been asking for ages. I mean, if you could identify potential terrorists that way, that would be huge, wouldn't it?
You'd think so. But the research we've looked at suggests it's not that simple. This idea that there's a specific terrorist personality doesn't really hold up. So no easy answers there. But I'm guessing psychology still plays a role. It can't be completely irrelevant, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Even if there's no single profile, this research points to the importance of group dynamics, social identity, personal experiences, all of these things playing into how someone might become radicalized.
That makes sense. I mean, we're social creatures, right? Our beliefs, our behaviors, they're all influenced by the groups we're part of. And the experiences we have, it's got to be a factor.
Exactly. One of the key takeaways is that terrorist groups often provide that sense of belonging, purpose, identity, things that some people might be missing in their lives.
It's almost like a dark version of social psychology, right? The group becomes this surrogate family, offering acceptance, making them feel validated.
That's a great way to put it. And the sense of belonging, it gets reinforced through all these things. Shared rituals, ideologies, even acts of violence.
Yeah. I can see how doing those things together would create a really strong bond, a shared experience that separates them from the rest of the world.
Exactly. It solidifies their identity. As members of this group, fighting for this cause they believe in, it creates that us versus them mentality. And violence becomes a way to prove their loyalty, their commitment.
But it can't just be about belonging, right? There's got to be some sort of indoctrination, too, like a way to slowly change their beliefs so they think the violence is justified.
Oh, for sure. The research highlights the role of propaganda, charismatic leaders, peer pressure. All of these things work together to reinforce the ideology and make people less sensitive to violence.
It's kind of scary to think about, but it makes sense. It's this gradual process where their morals slowly shift until they actually believe that violence is necessary for the cause.
Right. It's a complex mix of factors.
Yeah.
And when it comes to motivations, well, those are always complex too, wouldn't you say?
I totally agree. So what did these researchers find about what drives someone to become a terrorist?
Well, the answers are, as you might expect, complex and varied. But there are some common themes that run through it all. Ideology, obviously, is a big one. It provides that framework, right, for understanding the world and justifying the use of violence.
But it's rarely just about ideology, right? I mean, there's got to be more to it than that.
You're right. Personal grievances, the need to belong, like we talked about, the desire for revenge. These can all be powerful motivators that push people towards extremism.
So it's often a combination of things, like a perfect storm of personal vulnerability and the appeal of the ideology itself.
Exactly. It's rarely a simple equation. But the research is clear. If you want to understand terrorist motivations, you got to look beyond the simple explanations. It's this intricate mix of individual psychology, social dynamics, and political context.
Wow. It's a fascinating puzzle. And it sounds like those early 2000 researchers were really starting to piece it together. Did they focus on any specific motivations? Like, was there anything that stood out in their work?
One area they were really interested in was religious extremism. How do religious beliefs get twisted to the point where they justify violence? It's a question that's relevant no matter what culture, what time period you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's a question that still bothers people today. So what did those early 2000 researchers have to say about it?
Well, they were particularly interested in millenarianism, the belief that, like, the apocalypse is coming or some big transformative event. Their research suggested that these beliefs could be exploited by charismatic leaders to manipulate followers and justify extreme actions.
That's powerful. If you really believe the world is ending or that a big battle is about to happen, then violence might seem like the only logical choice.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, about why certain people are drawn to those end times beliefs and how easily they can be led down a dangerous path. The research also talked about the way scripture is used to justify violence, how certain passages or interpretations can be twisted to support extremist views.
It's almost like those texts can be weaponized. Makes you wonder if there are ways to counter that, to promote more peaceful interpretations of those texts.
That's a really important point. It shows how important critical thinking is, and religious literacy, and just open dialogue to counter those extremist interpretations that twist those sacred texts to fit their own violent agenda.
I couldn't agree more. And it seems like this idea of context keeps coming up. We've talked about individual psychology, group dynamics. But what about the broader social and political environment?
Yes. That's another major theme, the impact of social and political context. The research suggests that certain conditions can create, like, fertile ground for extremist movements. Things like political instability, social injustice, widespread discrimination, the perception that you're marginalized, oppressed.
It's not hard to see how those things would lead to a lot of anger, desperation, making people more likely to buy into those extremist ideologies because they offer some kind of solution, even if it's a violent one.
Exactly. When people feel like they have no voice, no legitimate way to address their grievances, they're more likely to look to extreme solutions. The research also pointed to the role of governments. Their policies, their actions, they can either make things worse or help to calm things down.
So governments can either fuel extremism or help to stop it. Like, if they use really harsh crackdowns, discriminatory policies, those could backfire, push people further away. But on the other hand, policies that promote social justice, inclusion, those could actually help to counter radicalization.
It's a complicated dynamic, but it's something policymakers really need to keep in mind. The research we've looked at, it shows that countering terrorism isn't just about security. It's about fixing those underlying social and political problems that make societies vulnerable to extremism in the first place.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, right? You got to understand the individual psychology, the group dynamics, and the whole context that terrorism emerges from.
Exactly. That's one of the big takeaways from this early 2000s research. It gives us a more nuanced, more complete understanding of terrorism, which is still relevant today.
That's so interesting. So we've talked about the main themes, but what about debates? Were there areas where these researchers disagreed or had different perspectives?
Absolutely. Terrorism research is, by its very nature, full of debate. One of the most controversial issues was the definition of terrorism itself.
Yeah. The classic, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Exactly. There wasn't this universally agreed upon definition, which made it really hard to compare research or come to firm conclusions. It also highlights something important. Terrorism research is inherently political. It's not just this neutral, objective thing. It's always going to be tied up with power dynamics, ideologies, different narratives.
So these researchers were not only trying to understand terrorism, but also navigating this political minefield around it.
Right. And that complexity shows up in another debate, the effectiveness of different counterterrorism strategies.
So we're moving from understanding the problem to figuring out how to solve it. What were some of the different opinions on that?
Some researchers were really big on the law enforcement approach, focus on intelligence gathering, surveillance, targeted operations to disrupt terrorist networks.
That's the classic cut off the head of the snake strategy, right? Take out the leaders, disrupt the networks, and you cripple the organization.
Exactly. But other researchers argued that that approach was too narrow and that it often backfired, created more resentment, fueled more radicalization.
Yeah. I can see how that would happen. If it seems like you're unfairly targeting a specific group, you might actually create more sympathy for their cause.
That's what they were arguing. And they pushed for a more comprehensive approach, one that tackled the root causes of terrorism, poverty, inequality, political oppression, things like that.
So it's like treat the disease, not just the symptoms. But that's much harder to do, isn't it? It's not as simple as just capturing or killing terrorists.
You're right. It requires long-term commitment, collaboration across different areas, and a willingness to address these deep-rooted systemic issues.
And it means having some really tough conversations about power, privilege, inequality.
It definitely does. But this research suggests that if we want to really counter terrorism, we need to move beyond those short-term fixes. We need to tackle those deeper problems that contribute to it in the first place. It's about prevention, not just reaction.
It's fascinating to see how these debates were already happening back in the early 2000s, and I bet they're still going on today.
Oh, absolutely. The challenges of defining terrorism, understanding its roots, and finding effective ways to counter it, those haven't gone away. And with globalization, the internet, everything's amplified, so it's probably even more complex now.
That's why it's so important to look back at this research. It gives us a better understanding of this complex issue and how our thinking about it has evolved.
I couldn't agree more. It reminds us that this is an ongoing process. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider. And in that spirit, there's one more aspect of this research that I think will really resonate with listeners. It gets at the heart of how people become involved in terrorist groups. It's a little bit chilling, but incredibly insightful.
Okay, now you've really got me curious. What's this final piece of the puzzle?
Well, we'll have to save that for part 3 of our deep dive. But trust me, it's worth the wait.
I'm hooked. Let's take a short break, and then we'll be right back with the final part of this fascinating look at terrorism research. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this fascinating journey exploring this whole collection of terrorism research, and you're about to tell us more about this pathway to radicalization.
Right. This is where things get really interesting and, well, kind of disturbing too. A lot of this research highlights how it often starts with a feeling of being left out. Like, alienated, marginalized.
So these are people who feel like they're on the outside looking in, like disconnected from the rest of society.
Exactly. They might feel like they don't have a say in the political process.
Right.
Or that they're being discriminated against because of their race, religion, beliefs. Just this general feeling of not belonging.
So they're vulnerable, looking for something to fill that void, that need for connection. And that's where terrorist groups come in.
Yeah, these groups offer a strong sense of community, purpose, identity, things that these individuals might be really craving.
It's almost like a twisted kind of social psychology, isn't it? The group becomes their family, giving them that acceptance, validation.
That's a great way to put it. And this research shows how that feeling of belonging, it gets reinforced through shared rituals, the ideology, even acts of violence they do together.
I can see how that would work. Committing those acts together would create a really strong bond, like a shared experience that separates them from everyone else.
Exactly. It strengthens their identity. As members of this group, fighting for their cause. It's that us versus them mentality. Violence becomes their way of proving loyalty, commitment.
But there's got to be more to it than just belonging, right? I mean, there's a process of indoctrination, too, where they slowly start to believe that the violence is justified.
Oh, absolutely. The research points to the role of propaganda, these charismatic leaders, even peer pressure from others in the group. All of that helps to strengthen those extremist beliefs.
Yeah.
And desensitize them to violence.
It's almost like brainwashing, isn't it? This slow process where their sense of right and wrong gets twisted until violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. But we have to understand how this works
if
we want to do anything about it. And part of that is understanding this staircase model of radicalization. Have you heard of that term before?
I haven't, but it sounds interesting. What is a staircase model?
It's a way to visualize the steps people go through as they become more and more involved in a terrorist group.
Yeah.
They might start with something small, like attending meetings, maybe distributing propaganda.
Like dipping their toes in the water before they jump all the way in.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. But then they gradually get pulled into more serious activities, like training exercises, eventually even carrying out acts of violence.
So each step up this staircase represents a higher level of commitment and more willingness to be violent.
Exactly. And with each step, it becomes harder to turn back. The group dynamics, the ideology, the violence they've already been part of, it all creates this powerful pull that keeps them moving forward.
It's not like someone just decides to become a terrorist overnight. It's this process, this journey that can take a long time. It's pretty unsettling, but understanding that progression is important, isn't it?
It is. Maybe if we can identify who's at risk, we can intervene early, before they get to the point of no return.
That makes a lot of sense. Early intervention could be key. What are some things we should be looking for? What makes someone more susceptible to this kind of influence?
Well, this research suggests things like social isolation, feelings of alienation, not having a sense of purpose or identity, experiencing discrimination or injustice. These are all things that can make someone vulnerable, more receptive to those extremist messages.
So it's not just about identifying who might become a terrorist. It's about helping them with those vulnerabilities, giving them other ways to find belonging, purpose, ways to connect to society in a positive way.
Exactly. It's about building a world where fewer people feel like they're pushed to the margins. A world where everyone have opportunities, where they feel like their voices matter, where they belong.
That's a huge challenge, but a really important one. This whole deep dive has been so fascinating and, well, kind of sobering too, honestly. It reminds us that terrorism is this really complex problem with roots in individual psychology, group dynamics, social and political forces.
I agree. It's been amazing to explore how these experts were thinking about terrorism back then. And even though these sources are from a while ago, their insights are still relevant today.
Yeah, they remind us that terrorism isn't just a political issue or a security issue. It's a human issue. It's about understanding what motivates people, what makes them vulnerable, and those complex paths that lead them down this dark road.
And ultimately, the solutions aren't just about military force or intelligence gathering. It's about creating a world that's more just, more inclusive, more resilient.
A world where everyone feels like they belong, like they have a voice, where they can contribute to building a better future. That's something worth working towards.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that hopeful note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But as always, we want to encourage you to keep exploring these issues, think critically, ask questions, and most importantly, have meaningful conversations with each other.
Because understanding terrorism is a process that never ends. And it's only through continuous learning, empathy, and working together to build a better world that we can hope to prevent violence and create a more peaceful future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.